At 76 years old, Edna Whitmore sat in the formal living room of the Jasper house she had polished for nearly 5 decades, feeling like a ghost already haunting the corridors of her own life. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of betrayal, as her eldest son Marshall paced the Persian rug his father had bought with the profits Edna had painstakingly calculated in her hand-drawn ledgers. Across from her, Gail sat checking her gold watch with a clinical impatience that made the chest of Edna feel as though it were being filled with cold, heavy ash. There was no funeral shroud in this room, only the rustle of legal papers and the sharp click of a pen that sounded like a hammer driving nails into a coffin. They were not mourning their father Leonard, who had been buried just 3 days ago. Instead, they were performing a surgical extraction of the entire existence of Edna from the foundation she had built with her own 2 hands since 1977. Marshall stopped pacing and looked at his mother not with grief but with the cold eyes of a landlord dealing with a tenant who had overstayed her welcome by 49 years. "You have to understand, Edna, that we are being more than fair," Marshall said, his voice dropping into that condescending tone he usually reserved for slow-witted employees at the furniture store. He held up a thick manila folder containing the inventory of the Whitmore legacy, the business Edna had kept breathing through recessions and family crises, while Leonard took the credit and the titles. To Marshall and Gail, she was just the helper silent machine that had processed orders and sketched catalogues until her fingers were permanently stiff from the labor. Marshall did not mention the 50,000 hours she had spent in the back office or the nights she had spent lifting the bedridden body of Leonard in his final years. Instead, he spoke of assets, of overhead, of the 40% drop in efficiency he blamed on her sentimental attachment to obsolete methods. He stood there with a straight face and told the woman who had sacrificed a scholarship to an art institute in Chicago to buy the first delivery truck of his father that she had never invested a single dollar in the company. To them, she was a passenger on a luxury cruise she had actually spent her life building from the hull up, and now they were throwing her overboard without a life jacket. Gail leaned forward, her voice polished and sharp as a diamond ring as she slid a rusted brass key across the mahogany coffee table toward her mother. "At 76, you do not need a mansion, Edna," she said, refusing to even use the word mother, as if the biological bond had been liquidated along with the bank accounts. "We have looked at the taxes and the maintenance, and it is just not practical for a widow to live in a house this size, so Marshall will be moving in on Monday to oversee the transition of the business. But we are not leaving you with nothing, because we have found the deed to that old saltbox property in Greenbush, Wisconsin, that the grandfather of the family left to his son back in the 80s. It was a calculated insult, disguised as a charity gift, a derelict shack 5 hours away, in a town that Leonard used to call a graveyard for failures." As Edna reached out her trembling hand to touch the cold metal of the key, she felt a vacuum in her chest that threatened to collapse her lungs. Her children were looking at her with a mixture of pity and boredom, waiting for her to sign away the Jasper house and disappear into the Wisconsin woods. What Marshall and Gail did not realize as they watched their mother tuck her shaking hands under her thighs was that they were committing the same fatal error their father had made for nearly half a century. They looked at Edna and saw a faded botanical illustrator, a senile bookkeeper whose time had passed and whose value was zero. They saw a woman being exiled to a moldy ruin in the middle of nowhere, but they failed to see the precision in her observant blue eyes or the resilience that had been forged in the fires of silent dedication. They thought they were giving her a pile of dust and a death sentence, but in their greed to strip her of everything visible, they were handing her the only piece of the Whitmore history they had not bothered to poison with their presence. That rusted brass key felt unexpectedly heavy in the palm of Edna, pulsing with a strange cold energy, as if it were waiting for a pair of eyes that finally knew how to see. What looked like the most humiliating day of her long life was actually the first day of her real one, and the secret waiting for her behind the locked door in Greenbush was about to turn their world of numbers and greed into a landscape of ash. If you have ever felt like your years of silent sacrifice were invisible to the ones you love the most, or if you have been betrayed by your own flesh and blood for the sake of $1, then this story is for you. If someone has ever tried to make you believe that you are too old to start over, or that your dreams are just a hobby to be discarded When it becomes convenient, then you cannot afford to miss what happens next. You are about to witness the moment a woman left for dead in a worthless house proves that the most powerful thing in the world is a soul that has been underestimated for too long. Subscribe to the channel right now, because every woman deserves to see the moment the discarded mother becomes the powerful queen of her own empire. And I promise you that what Edna discovers behind that locked door will change everything you thought you knew about justice. Stay with us until the very last second, because the price of greed is about to be paid in full. And this is a story that will make your heart overflow with the truth you have been waiting to hear. Welcome to the heart of the story. To understand the hollow silence of that living room in Jasper, one must travel back to the sweltering Indiana summer of 1977, when Edna was 27 years old, and the world smelled of fresh pine and endless possibility. She had been a girl with a scholarship to the Art Institute of Chicago tucked into her leather satchel, and a heart full of vibrant watercolors waiting to be splashed onto canvas. At a regional trade fair, Leonard Whitmore had been selling hand-carved oak chairs, while Edna sat on a nearby bench sketching the intricate grain of the wood with a precision that made the furniture look more alive on paper than it did in the booth. Leonard was 30 then, with an ambitious fire in his eyes that Edna mistook for passion, and he had stood over her shoulder watching her pencil move with a grace he knew he could never replicate. He didn't just see a talented woman, he saw a strategic asset who could give his rough carpentry a polished brand that would sell to the wealthy families in Indianapolis. He promised her a partnership of equals, where her art would be the soul of his wood, and in her youthful desire to be useful, Edna mistook his need for her skills as a profound love for her person. The scholarship letter from Chicago sat on her kitchen table for 3 weeks like a heavy stone that she eventually threw into the river of her own regret. In the autumn of 1977, she took her entire personal savings of $2,100, which she had painstakingly earned from selling botanical prints, and bought Leonard his first real delivery truck. It was a used Ford with a rusted bumper and a stalling engine. But to Edna it was the vehicle that would carry their future toward the horizon of success. She believed that by investing her money and her talent, she was securing a seat at the head of the table for the rest of her life. She told herself that she would paint her watercolors in the evenings after the business was established, but the evenings were quickly swallowed by the demands of a growing inventory. The scent of linseed oil and turpentine that used to cling to her fingers was gradually replaced by the smell of bitter black coffee and the metallic tang of printer ink. She became the invisible architect of the Whitmore legacy, building the walls of an empire, while Leonard stood in the sunlight of the storefront, taking the bows and the handshakes. By the 5th year of the marriage, the patterns of their lives had set like concrete in the foundations of the Jasper house. Edna would rise at 5 in the morning while the Indiana mist still clung to the oak trees and begin the meticulous work of the inventory ledgers that Leonard found too tedious to manage. She created a system of hand-drawn grid notebooks where every screw, every plank of mahogany, and every finished chair was tracked with a clerical obsession that saved the business from bankruptcy during the recession of the early 80s. While Leonard slept, she was calculating the overhead and sketching the first seasonal catalogs that would define the Whitmore aesthetic for decades. She wasn't just a bookkeeper. She was the one who decided which fabrics would cover the sofas and which finishes would catch the light in a customer's dining room. But when the accountants came to the office, Leonard would always lean back in his leather chair and speak of my company and my vision, while Edna sat in the corner with her head down adjusting the columns of numbers. She was the engine under the hood of a car that Leonard drove with arrogant ease, never once checking to see if the parts were wearing thin. Marshall was born in 1974, and even as a toddler, he seemed to absorb the dismissive atmosphere his father projected toward the back office where Edna worked. By the time he was 10 years old, he would walk into her workspace with muddy boots and demand snacks or attention, without ever acknowledging the complex ledgers spread across her desk. He watched how his father spoke to her, not as a wife or a partner, but as a senior employee whose primary function was to facilitate his comfort. Edna would look at her son and see the same cold calculation in his eyes that she saw in the mirror of her husband's gaze, but she told herself it was just the arrogance of youth. She rewarded his selfishness with silent dedication, thinking that if she worked hard enough to provide him with a life of luxury, he would eventually understand the weight of her sacrifice. She spent her nights sewing the buttons back onto his expensive school blazers and her days managing the warehouse staff, who respected her more than they did Leonard, but she never asked for a title or a salary. She believed the house and the business were her retirement fund, her safety net, and her proof of a life well spent. Gail arrived 5 years after Marshall, bringing with her a polished coldness that seemed out of place in the warm, floral, wallpapered rooms of the Jasper home. From the moment she could speak, Gail was more interested in the price of the silver than the stories Edna would try to tell her about the botanical gardens in Chicago. While Edna tried to teach her how to mix watercolors and observe the delicate veins in a maple leaf, Gail would pull away her eyes, already fixed on the jewelry catalogs that arrived in the mail. The children grew up in a house built on the labor of a woman they viewed as a permanent fixture, like the furnace or the roof. They never saw the sweat she wiped from her brow after unloading a shipment of upholstery fabric, or the way her hands shook with fatigue after staying up until 2 in the morning to finish the year-end taxes. To Marshall and Gail, their mother was a background character in the story of their father's greatness, and Leonard did nothing to disabuse them of that notion. He began to treat Edna's hand-drawn catalogues as free labor, telling her that her little paintings were a nice hobby that helped the business, but were hardly professional work. The first seed of the Greenbush secret was planted in 1981 during a rare and tense visit from Leonard's mother, Florence Whitmore. Florence was a woman of sharp silences and eyes that seemed to see through the mahogany veneers of the Jasper house to the hollow spaces underneath. She had stayed for only 2 nights, but on the final morning she had pulled Edna into the kitchen and handed her a small embroidered sachet of dried lavender. Florence had looked at the calluses on Edna's fingers and the way she flinched when Leonard called for her from the other room with a command in his voice. "You are building a castle for a man who doesn't know how to live in one." Florence had whispered, her voice like dry leaves skittering across a porch. "Remember that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones people are too blind to look for." Not long after that visit, Leonard inherited the Saltbox house in Wisconsin when Florence passed away, but he refused to even visit the property. He called it a graveyard for failures and a pile of rot that wasn't worth the gas it would take to drive there. Edna had tucked the deed into the back of her 1981 inventory ledger, never realizing that Florence had seen the trap she was in 40 years before the door finally slammed shut. By the year 1997, the Whitmore furniture business was a regional powerhouse, and the children were being groomed to take over the roles they felt were their birthright. Marshall had returned from business school with a portfolio full of graphs and a heart full of resentment for his mother's obsolete methods of hand-drawn bookkeeping. He would stand over her shoulder in the office, criticizing the time she spent on her catalog illustrations and suggesting that they replace her watercolor work with cheap digital photography. Edna would feel a sharp pang in her chest as her own son spoke to her with a condescending tone, as if she were a slow-witted clerk instead of the woman who had kept the lights on when the bank was threatening to foreclose. Leonard would just nod in agreement with his son, looking at Edna with a boredom that was more painful than anger. She was nearly 50 then, and her identity had been completely erased from the public face of the company. She was the one who knew every customer's name and the history of every piece of timber in the warehouse, but on the company's 25th anniversary plaque, only the names of Leonard and Marshall were engraved in the brass. The decline of Leonard's health began on a Tuesday in 2023, and for the next 3 years, Edna's life became a marathon of physical and emotional exhaustion. She transitioned from the office to the bedroom, becoming a 24-hour caregiver for a man who had forgotten how to say thank you decades ago. She lifted his heavy frame to prevent bed sores, she cleaned him with a tenderness he hadn't earned, and she read to him from his favorite biographies until her voice was a raspy whisper. Her own bones ached with a constant dull throb, and the silver in her hair seemed to multiply with every passing month. Marshall and Gail would visit on Sundays for exactly 1 hour, sitting on the edge of the expensive chairs Edna had polished and complaining about the cost of the private nurses they refused to hire. They would talk over her head about the liquidation of the estate and the restructuring of the business, as if she were already a ghost haunting the hallway. Edna would sit by the window holding Leonard's cold hand and watching the winter sun set over the Indiana fields, feeling the walls she had built slowly beginning to crush the air from her lungs. In the final year before Leonard's death, Edna found herself retreating into her old grid notebooks not to balance the accounts, but to document her own erasure. She realized that she had no legal standing in the company she had built, because every document she had ever signed had been in Leonard's name alone. She had trusted him with her youth, her talent, and her financial security, and he had treated that trust as a gift he was entitled to consume. She saw Marshall and Gail beginning to move the furniture out of the house, even before their father's heart had stopped beating, as if they were vultures waiting for the last breath to leave his body. The children who had once been the center of her world were now the architects of her exile, looking at her with a mixture of pity and clinical impatience. She felt a profound and quiet failure in her soul, wondering if she had been too weak or too trusting, or simply too invisible to matter. As she looked at the rusted brass key to the Greenbush house, which Leonard had kept in a junk drawer like a forgotten piece of scrap, she felt a strange and cold premonition that her long journey through the desert of other people's greed was finally coming to a crossroads. The room in Jasper had never felt so vast or so empty as it did that Monday morning when the junior clerk from the law firm of the husband of Gail opened his leather briefcase with a sound like a serrated blade cutting through the silence of 49 years of marriage. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the metallic tang of a betrayal that had been decades in the making. Edna sat on the very edge of the velvet chair she had personally upholstered in 1992, feeling the cold draft from the hallway where the shadows of her children loomed like debt collectors. Marshall did not look at her instead. He adjusted his silk tie in the mirror above the mantelpiece, while Gail scrolled through her phone with a clinical detachment that made the atmosphere feel thin and brittle. There was no mention of the father who had been cold in the ground for less than a week, only the rustle of spreadsheets that treated the life of a woman as a line item to be deleted for the sake of a cleaner profit margin. The clerk cleared his throat, and the ritual of legal erasure began in earnest, while Edna tucked her shaking hands beneath her thighs. Marshall stepped forward and began to read from the valuation report, his voice carrying a sharp edge of triumph that he did not even try to hide from the woman who had birthed him. He announced that the Whitmore furniture business was valued at $580,000 in liquid assets and inventory, but he paused to look directly at Edna with eyes as hard as polished flint. He told her that since the company was registered solely in the name of Leonard, and since she had never officially held a position of legal ownership, they had decided to consolidate all shares under his own management to ensure the future stability of the brand. He did not mention the notebooks filled with her designs, or the thousands of nights she spent balancing the books while he was away at expensive summer camps. He spoke as if she were a guest who had stayed too long in a hotel she had actually built stone by stone with her own labor. The cruelty was in the clinical precision of the numbers, which were calculated to make her entire existence appear as a zero on the balance sheet of the family legacy. Gail did not even look up from her glowing screen when she delivered the second blow, her voice smooth and practiced, as she addressed the fate of the family home, valued at $410,000. She told Edna that at 76 years old, she had to realize the house was a liability, with property taxes and maintenance costs that were far too heavy for a widow to manage alone. She spoke of the mansion as if it were a burden they were kindly lifting from the shoulders of their mother, but the truth was written in the way she reached out to touch the silver tea service Edna had polished every week for decades. She announced that Marshall would be moving into the house on Monday to oversee the transition, because it was simply the most practical solution for the estate of their father. They were carving up the territory of her life while she was still breathing the very air in the room, turning her memories into square footage that now belonged to the children who viewed her as an administrative error. The house where she had raised them was being handed over like a prize to the son who had never even learned how the furnace worked. Before Edna could even process the loss of her home, Marshall dropped a heavy set of legal papers onto the mahogany coffee table with a thud that echoed through the quiet room like a gavel. He told her that they had already contacted a professional moving company and that the trucks would be arriving at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to begin the packing process, so she should start deciding which personal items she wanted to keep. The casual nature of the announcement was a jagged glass edge against the heart of Edna, as she realized they had already planned her eviction while she was still picking out the clothes for the funeral of her husband. They had not asked her where she wanted to go, or how she felt about leaving the only world she had known since 1977. They had simply made a phone call and hired strangers to put her life into cardboard boxes, as if she were a troublesome tenant being cleared out of a condemned building. The indifference in the eyes of Marshall was more painful than a scream, because it proved that to him she was nothing more than an obstacle to be moved aside. Gail then slid a tattered deed across the table, as if she were offering a grand prize in a lottery that Edna had never asked to enter or even knew existed. She said that they were not leaving her on the street, because they had found the deed to that old saltbox property in Greenbush, Wisconsin, that the grandfather had left behind 40 years ago. She called it a charity gift and an opportunity for a fresh start in a quiet town where Edna could finally relax without the pressures of the Jasper House. They both knew the house was a derelict ruin worth barely $14,000 in a town that Leonard had spent his entire life mocking as a graveyard for failures. They were giving her a wooden box in the middle of nowhere and calling it a blessing, while they kept nearly $1 million in assets for themselves. It was a calculated insult, disguised as a gesture of goodwill, a way to get her out of their sight and out of their ledgers without the public guilt of leaving her literally homeless. She looked at the rusted key and felt the weight of their contempt pressing down on her shoulders. The most devastating blow came when Marshall walked over to the corner of the room where the hand-drawn catalogues of Edna from the 1980s were stacked in neat protective sleeves. He told her that these represented a lot of wasted time and obsolete thinking, and that they really did not have the space to store this kind of junk in the new digital inventory system he was implementing. He picked up the 1985 catalogue, the one Edna had stayed up 3 consecutive nights to finish, while she was suffering from a fever, and he tossed it toward the trash bin. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the bottom of the plastic container was the sound of her youth being discarded as a worthless hobby by the boy who had once used those same pages to learn the names of colors. He mocked the precision of her watercolor illustrations and the technical detail of her textile designs, calling them the quaint scribbles of a woman who did not understand how the real world of business worked. He was erasing the soul of the company she had kept alive, while calling her work a burden on the progress of the family name. As Edna sat there, her heart feeling like a piece of dry wood being crushed by a heavy iron vice, Marshall leaned down until his face was inches from hers, and his breath smelled of the expensive scotch he had taken from the cabinet of his father. He whispered that Dad had always said she was the help and not the partner, so she should not make this more difficult than it already was by getting sentimental about things that were never truly hers. The word help was a poisoned arrow that pierced the very center of her identity for 49 years of silent dedication. It reduced her to a servant who had been paid in room and board, rather than a woman who had invested every penny of her savings and every ounce of her talent into the foundation of their wealth. He looked at her, not as a mother who had sacrificed her own dreams so he could have a life of luxury, but as a nuisance who was standing between him and the money he felt he deserved. The betrayal was complete, and the silence that followed his words was a cold, heavy blanket that threatened to suffocate her. Edna felt a sudden and violent trembling in her hands, a shaking so profound that she had to tuck them deeper under her thighs to hide the evidence of her internal collapse from their judgmental eyes. Her chest felt as though it had been hollowed out by a vacuum, leaving her lungs filled with the bitter ash of a burned-down life. She tried to speak, to tell them about the truck she bought in 1977, or the ledgers that saved the store in 1982, but her throat was a desert of dry salt, and her voice had been stolen by the magnitude of their cruelty. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, the expensive wallpaper she had chosen, with such care now looking like the bars of a cage that was finally opening to let her fall into a dark abyss. She realized in that terrible moment that she had built the very walls that were now crushing the life out of her, and the people she had loved the most were the ones holding the hammers. The physical pain in her bones was a dull roar that drowned out the sound of the clerk ticking off items. While Edna struggled to find a single breath of air in the suffocating room, Marshall and Gail returned to their devices with a terrifying indifference that spoke of a complete lack of soul. Gail was scrolling through an upholstery website, looking for new fabrics for the Jasper House, while Marshall checked the stock market as if the destruction of the world of his mother was just a minor administrative task. They did not look at her to see the tears that refused to fall, or the way her small frame seemed to shrink into the velvet chair. They treated her silence as a sign of agreement, and her shock as a sign of senility, waiting with a visible impatience for her to get up and leave so they could begin the renovation of their new property. To them, she was already gone, a ghost that was simply taking up space in a room that needed to be cleaned and modernized for a new generation. The lack of anger in their voices was more chilling than a scream, because it proved they did not even consider her a worthy opponent for their hostility. The cruelty did not stop when the meeting ended, as Marshall immediately picked up a roll of blue painter tape and began marking off sections of the wall while Edna was still sitting in the chair. He started talking about ripping down the floral wallpaper she had applied with her own hands 20 years ago, calling it a grandmotherly eyesore that would have to be replaced with a modern grey aesthetic for his own comfort. He did not wait for her to leave. He did not even wait for the clerk to finish the paperwork before he began the physical process of erasing her presence from the house. Gail joined him, pointing out the silver pieces she wanted to take to Indianapolis and the furniture she planned to sell at a liquidation auction on Wednesday. They were talking over her head about the value of her wedding china, as if she were a piece of furniture that had been included in the sale of a house to a stranger. The systematic invisibility they imposed on her was a cold blade that cut through the last remaining ties of her maternal devotion. Edna stood up in a silence that was more powerful than any scream she could have uttered in that house of greed. She walked past her children, who were now arguing over who would keep the grandfather clock, and she went to the small back room where her art supplies were kept. She did not take the expensive rugs or the silver sets she had polished until her knuckles bled and her joints ached. She took a single cardboard box and began to pack her watercolor tins, her brushes, and the hand-drawn grid notebooks that contained the true history of the Whitmore legacy. Every notebook she placed in the box was a year of her life. Every brush was a dream she had set aside to make room for the ambition of a man who never loved her enough to give her a name on a deed. She worked with a slow and deliberate precision, her trembling hands finally finding a rhythmic purpose in the act of salvage. She was leaving behind a mansion made of greed and taking with her the only things that could not be quantified by a junior clerk or liquidated by a greedy son. As she walked through the front door for the final time on that cold Tuesday morning, the movers were already carrying her old dresser out to the sidewalk with a careless disregard for the wood. Marshall was standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets, looking at the Indiana sky as if he had just conquered a kingdom, while Gail was already in her luxury SUV waiting for the engine to warm up. Edna did not look back at the windows of the Jasper house. She did not say a word of farewell to the children, who had treated her like a discarded tool. She placed her cardboard box in the trunk of her old sedan and gripped the rusted brass key to the Greenbush shack as if it were a weapon she was finally learning how to wield. She turned her back on the 49 years of silent sacrifice and the empire of ash they had built on her bones, and she drove toward the north. The road ahead was long and lonely, but for the first time in nearly half a century, she was the one behind the wheel, and the silence was no longer a cage. At this point in the story, I want you to take a second and look at the life of Edna, and then look at your own circumstances. What would you do if the people you built a world for suddenly decided you were just a line item to be deleted from the ledger of their lives? Leave a comment below with the word justice if you believe that Marshall and Gail are about to learn the most expensive lesson of their lives, and tell me what you think Edna is going to find when she reaches that shack in Wisconsin. Your interaction helps us keep telling stories about the strength of women who refuse to be erased. So please like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that their value is not determined by the greed of others. We are about to enter the desert of the exile of Edna, but I promise you that the sun is about to rise on a secret that will change everything you thought you knew. Stay with us, because the next chapter is where the invisible woman starts to become the one thing her children should have feared the most. Let us continue. The drive north was a 5-hour funeral procession of one where the only attendee was a woman carrying the wreckage of her own life in a single cardboard box. As the familiar rolling hills of Indiana flattened into the stark wind, swept plains of Wisconsin, Edna felt the weight of her 76 years in the very marrow of her aching bones. The vibrant green of the Jasper suburbs, where she had polished the floors of a mansion for 49 years, gave way to a landscape of skeletal trees and grey dormant fields that seemed to mirror the ash-filled vacuum in her chest. Every mile was a thread snapping a painful disconnection from the only world she had known since 1977, when she had first bought a delivery truck with her own savings. The engine of her old sedan hummed a lonely mechanical dirge, and the scent of lavender on her cardigan was slowly being replaced by the smell of cold, stale air and the metallic tang of the rusted brass key sitting in the cup holder like a jagged tooth. She was a woman driving toward her own erasure, a discarded ghost looking for a place to haunt, in a town that her husband had always called a graveyard for failures. When she finally turned onto Elm Street in Greenbush, the sun was a bruised purple smear against the horizon, casting long distorted shadows across the overgrown yards of a town that time seemed to have forgotten. Number 112 stood at the end of a gravel road, a 1930s saltbox construction that looked more like a shipwreck than a home. The porch sagged like a broken jaw, and the white paint had long ago surrendered to the elements peeling away in grey flakes that littered the weeds like dead skin. The windows were filmed with decades of grime, reflecting nothing but the hollow exhaustion in the eyes of Edna as she stepped out of the car into the biting spring wind. The silence here was not peaceful. It was heavy and absolute, broken only by the rhythmic tap-tap of a loose shutter hitting the wood like a slow, indifferent heartbeat. It was a monument to neglect, a wooden coffin, waiting for a tenant who had nowhere else to go. And as Edna looked at the sagging roof, she felt the last flicker of her maternal hope vanish into the darkening sky. The key turned in the lock with a groan of protesting metal that vibrated up the arm of Edna, a sound that seemed to announce her arrival to the dust and the shadows. As she pushed the door open, the smell of damp cedar and ancient undisturbed dust rushed out to meet her, thick enough to coat the back of her throat and make her lungs feel heavy. The hallway was a tunnel of peeling wallpaper that hung in long wet strips, like the bandages of a mummy, revealing the dark-stained wood beneath. In the fading light, the interior felt smaller than it looked from the outside, with the ceilings low and oppressive and the floorboards creaking under her sensible shoes with a sharp, splintering wood sound. There was no furniture, no warmth, only the ghostly outlines on the walls where pictures had once hung 40 years ago, before Leonard decided the property was beneath his dignity. She stood in the center of the kitchen, her breath hitching in the biting cold of the Wisconsin night, realizing that her children had not sent her to a home, but to a ruin that was meant to be her final resting place. That first night was a descent into a darkness so profound it felt as though the world had simply ceased to exist beyond the saltbox walls of the Greenbush house. Edna did not unpack her watercolor tins or her grid notebooks. She simply sat on the cold kitchen floor, wrapped in 3 of her heavy winter coats, clutching her single cardboard box as if it were a life raft. The wind began to howl through the attic, a high-pitched grieving sound that made the entire house shiver and groan in its joints as if it were protesting her presence. In the absolute silence between the gusts, the fear finally found its way through the numbness of her shock, a cold, sharp blade that pierced the very center of her soul. She thought of the Jasper house with its heated floors and the silver she had polished until her knuckles bled, and she realized she was 76 years old, alone in a derelict shack with no one in the world who cared if she woke up the next morning. She wept then not with the quiet dignity of a mother, but with the raw, jagged sobs of a woman who had realized her entire life of sacrifice had been a deposit into a bank that had just declared bankruptcy. As the hours crawled toward midnight, the internal monologue of Edna became a carousel of regrets and bitter realizations that refused to let her find peace in the darkness. She remembered the scholarship to Chicago she had burned in 1977 and the $2,100 she had given Leonard for a truck that had long ago rusted into scrap. She could almost hear the voice of Marshall calling her a passenger, and the clinical indifference of Gail suggesting she needed a fresh start in this graveyard. The cold seeped through the floorboards and into her hip joints, a dull, throbbing ache that reminded her of her own fragility and the terrifying reality of her situation. If she fell here, if her heart simply decided it had beaten enough for a family that did not want her, it would be weeks before anyone found her body. She felt the crushing weight of her invisibility, the realization that she had built a palace for a man who did not know how to love her and raise children who viewed her existence as a line item to be deleted. The darkness felt like a physical weight, a thick black velvet that was slowly pressing the remaining air from her lungs. But the sun rose anyway, as it always does, indifferent to the tragedies of the women who lived beneath it, and the morning brought a clarity that the night had tried to hide. At 5 in the morning, the exact hour her body had been trained to wake for 49 years, a single sliver of pale ghostly light filtered through a small pane of stained glass in the hallway. It hit a specific patch of the staircase, illuminating a section of the peeling wallpaper, with a sudden brilliant clarity that caught the eye of the artist. Edna sat up, her bones stiff and her eyes swollen from the night of salt and sorrow, and she watched the dust motes dancing in the beam of light like tiny golden sparks. In that moment, the silent observer in her, the technician who had spent decades cataloguing the subtle veins of a maple leaf and the texture of mahogany, noticed something strange. There was a deliberate pattern in the way the wallpaper layers had been applied, a strange raised seam that caught the light in a way that felt like a secret whisper, meant only for her eyes. The change was not a dramatic surge of confidence or a sudden burst of joy. It was a quiet internal clicking into place, like a gear finally catching after years of spinning in a void. Edna did not stand up and scream at the world. She simply reached out and touched the cold, damp wood of the kitchen counter with her trembling fingers. She felt the grit of the dust and the rough grain of the cedar, and she realized that while the Jasper house was gone and the business was stolen, the precision of her hands and the strength of her observations were still hers. She was 76, and her joints ached, but her mind was still the meticulous engine that had saved the Whitmore legacy from the brink of collapse a dozen times. She stood up slowly, leaning against the wall for support, and she did not look for her phone to call Marshall or Gail to beg for a way back to the mansion. Instead, she reached into her cardboard box and pulled out a single clean rag and a bottle of vinegar she had tucked into the side before leaving Indiana. She began with the window in the kitchen, the one that looked out over the grey dormant fields of Greenbush and the gravel road that led to the horizon. She worked with a slow rhythmic intensity, scrubbing away 40 years of neglect, with the same clerical obsession she had once applied to the inventory ledgers of her husband. As the grime gave way to clear glass, the landscape outside began to sharpen, revealing the resilient buds of the Wisconsin spring pushing through the cold earth. Each circular motion of her arm was a silent reclamation of her own space, a declaration that she was no longer a ghost but a tenant with a purpose. The metallic tang of the cleaning supplies and the sharp scent of the vinegar filled the small room, grounding her in the physical reality of her new life. She was no longer building a world for someone else to take credit for. She was cleaning the windows of her own exile, and for the first time in nearly half a century, the view belonged entirely to her. The house seemed to groan as she moved through the rooms, the floorboards settling under her weight, as if acknowledging a presence that was finally paying attention to its needs. When she tried to open the window to let out the smell of damp cedar, the frame remained stubbornly jammed, the wood swollen with decades of Wisconsin winters and lack of care. Edna gripped the handles, her knuckles white, and her breath hitching with the effort, feeling the resistance of the house, testing her resolve like a stubborn enemy. In the Jasper mansion, she would have called a handyman or waited for Leonard to complain until she fixed it herself, but here there was only the silence and her own stubborn will. She did not give up. She adjusted her grip, braced her feet, and pushed with a strength she had not known she still possessed in her small frame. With a sharp, splintering crack that echoed like a gunshot through the empty rooms, the window flew upward, and the cold, fresh air of the north rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a world that did not know how to be cruel. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the deep, hidden corners of the Saltbox house, Edna felt a strange, cold energy beginning to pulse from the rusted brass key in her pocket. She walked to the staircase, where the light had first caught her eye, and she ran her fingers over the raised seam in the wallpaper, feeling a hard metallic object buried beneath the floral layers. It was not a flaw in the construction, or a simple piece of debris. It was something hidden with a precision that mirrored her own, a secret placed there 40 years ago by a woman who had also known what it was like to be invisible. As she reached for her small palette knife to cut into the paper, a shadow fell across the front porch, and a firm, rhythmic knock sounded at the door. Edna froze the knife inches from the secret on the wall, as a voice from the other side of the sagging wood called out with a calm, steady authority that made the heart of the exile skip a beat. It was the sound of a living soul in the middle of her isolation, and for a second the woman who had lost everything felt the weight of a new and terrifying possibility. The heavy, rhythmic knock on the front door shattered the silence of the Saltbox house like a stone thrown through a window of thin ice. Edna stood paralyzed on the third step of the staircase, her small palette knife inches from the raised seam in the wallpaper where a secret had been waiting for 40 years. Through the dusty glass of the sidelight, she saw a woman standing on the sagging porch, wearing a thick wool coat and holding a large stainless steel thermos with a steady, familiar grace. It was Norma Egan, the local librarian and town historian, a woman of 64 who carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent her life cataloguing the stories of others. When Edna finally opened the door, the cold Wisconsin air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a conversation that did not involve the liquidation of her soul. Norma did not ask for permission. She simply stepped inside and handed Edna a cup of steaming black coffee that smelled of chicory and kindness. She looked at the peeling wallpaper and then at the shaking hands of Edna, with eyes that had seen many women arrive in Greenbush with nothing but a cardboard box and a broken heart. Norma set her heavy-duty flashlight on the kitchen counter and looked at Edna with a piercing gaze that seemed to strip away the 49 years of invisibility she had suffered in Jasper. She said that in this town the houses test you before they welcome you, and she asked if Edna needed a hand with the grit that comes with a fresh start. Edna felt a strange lump in her throat as she realized this was the first time in decades someone had offered her help without expecting an inventory report in return. She told Norma about the raised seam on the staircase and the strange cold energy she felt pulsing from the wood behind the floral patterns of the 1930s paper. Norma did not laugh or suggest that Edna was losing her mind. Instead, she nodded with a profound and somber respect. She whispered that Florence Whitmore had not hidden herself because she was weak, but because she was protecting something too bright for the men in this family to handle. It was a sentence that changed the air in the room, turning the derelict shack from a graveyard of failures into a fortress of secrets that were finally ready to be revealed to a pair of eyes that knew how to see. They walked back to the staircase together, the floorboards creaking a steady accompaniment to their breathing as the pale morning light hit the specific patch of the wall. Edna took the palette knife and began to cut into the brittle layers of the wallpaper, the sound of the blade through the old paper, a sharp, rhythmic, raspy noise that felt like a surgical incision. Beneath the first layer of 1980s floral print, they found a thick application of 1950s damask, and beneath that, the original 1930s silk embroidery thread. As the final layer gave way, a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth fell into the palm of Edna with a dull, metallic thud that resonated through her entire arm. She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a brass skeleton key, its surface etched with the initials FW and its weight, suggesting a density that was more than just metal. It was cold to the touch and smelled of old machine oil and lavender, as if it had been preserved in a vacuum of time. The key felt like a weapon or a bridge, and as Edna gripped it, she felt the first surge of a power that had nothing to do with the Whitmore Furniture bank accounts. With Norma holding the flashlight, they began a frantic but meticulous search for the lock that matched the brass key moving through the upstairs rooms with the precision of explorers. They found it behind a massive oak wardrobe in the small rear bedroom, a piece of furniture so heavy and imposing that Leonard's father had bolted it to the wall studs decades ago to serve as a permanent barrier. It was a deliberate obstruction meant to hide the small circular brass keyhole that was positioned exactly 3 feet from the floor, hidden by the shadow of the heavy wood. Together they braced their shoulders against the wardrobe, pushing with a collective strength born of shared widowhood and the stubborn refusal to be ignored any longer. With a sharp, splintering groan of protesting timber, the wardrobe slid 6 inches to the left, revealing a small oak door that was flush with the wall and nearly invisible to the naked eye. Edna inserted the brass key into the hole, and as she turned it, she heard a heavy internal click that sounded like a final judgment being passed on the greed of her children in Indiana. The door swung open on hinges that had been greased 40 years ago, with a silence that was more terrifying than a scream revealing a steep, narrow staircase leading into the attic. As Edna climbed the steps, the air became miraculously dry and cool, smelling of linseed oil and the sharp metallic tang of mineral pigments. When she reached the top, she found herself standing in a hidden atelier that spanned the entire length of the Saltbox house, bathed in a soft northern light from a long row of skylights. Arranged on custom-built racks were 74 original watercolors of Lake Michigan, each one perfectly preserved and glowing with a luminosity that looked like liquid jewels captured on paper. The colors were vibrant and strange, with deep malachite greens and glowing ochre yellows that Edna had never seen in any commercial paint set. There was a precision in the brushwork that mirrored her own technical skills, but with a soul and a fire that made the botanical illustrations she had done for Leonard look like a child's scribbles. This was the secret life of Florence Whitmore, a woman who had painted a masterpiece every year while the world thought she was just a quiet grandmother in a dying town. In the center of the room sat a small mahogany desk, and on top of it were 6 leather-bound journals titled The Florence Method, which contained the detailed formulas for creating permanent pigments. Edna opened the first volume and saw the meticulous handwriting of her mother-in-law documenting the process of extracting color from local malachite and plant resins. These journals were the blueprint for a lost art, a technical manual for a quality of pigment that could revolutionize the world of fine art and restoration. Beside the journals lay a single ivory envelope, addressed to the woman who finds the key in a script that was as elegant as a vine. Edna sat on the small wooden stool, her hands trembling, as she broke the wax seal and began to read the words of a woman who had died just weeks after hiding this room from her own son. Florence wrote that she had spent her life building a fortress for her soul because she knew that Leonard and his father would have sold her heart by the square inch if they had ever found it. She told Edna that she had been waiting for a pair of eyes that knew how to see, and that this room was now the inheritance of the one who had the patience to find it. But the most powerful discovery was tucked into the back of the final journal, a notarized codicil dated October 14, 1980, which changed the legal landscape of the Whitmore legacy forever. The document stated in clear and cold legal prose that the contents of the upper floor of the Greenbush property were never to enter the Whitmore estate and were gifted solely to the resident of the house who discovers them by hand. It was a strategic masterstroke, a legal poison pill that severed the 74 watercolors and the pigment formulas from the reach of Marshall and Gale. Norma looked over her shoulder, the light from her flashlight illuminating the official seal of the Wisconsin notary, and she let out a long, low whistle of pure amazement. She estimated that based on her knowledge of the Milwaukee art market, the collection alone was valued at $520,000, but the formulas in the journals were worth millions to the right buyer. Edna was no longer a discarded widow in a derelict shack. She was the legal owner of a fortune that her children had been too arrogant and too blind to even imagine. The physical reality of the discovery hit Edna with a force that made her lungs feel as though they were finally filling with clean, fresh air instead of the ash of betrayal. She looked at her own hands, the ones that Marshall had called the tools of a passenger, and she realized that she now held the key to the destruction of his own ego. The 64 journals and the 74 paintings were not just assets, they were the ammunition she needed to reclaim the 49 years of silent dedication she had given to a family that did not deserve her. She turned to Norma, her blue eyes no longer faded but sharp with a predatory clarity that would have terrified Marshall if he could have seen it. They spent the rest of the morning planning the reconstruction of the house, not as a home, but as a gallery that would be bone white and filled with the light of the north. Every circular motion of the cleaning rag Edna used on the windows now felt like a sharpening of a blade, and every creak of the floorboards was a step toward a confrontation that would turn the Jasper mansion into a house of cards. As the sun reached its zenith, illuminating the liquid jewel pigments of the Lake Michigan series, Edna picked up a fine sable brush that had been waiting for a hand for 40 years. She dipped it into a jar of malachite green pigment she had mixed following the instructions of Florence, and she made a single precise stroke on a piece of clean parchment. The color was so deep and so permanent that it seemed to vibrate against the paper, a silent declaration of war against the grey digital aesthetic of her son. She was 76 years old, and she was about to become the most dangerous woman the Whitmore family had ever known, because she had the technical knowledge of the past and the financial power of a secret they could never steal. The silence of the Greenbush house was no longer a cage. It was the quiet before a storm that would carry the scent of lavender and the sting of justice across the Indiana border. Edna Whitmore was no longer hiding behind the wallpaper of her own life. She was the one holding the brush, and she was about to paint a masterpiece of revenge that would be documented in every ledger of the world. 7 months had passed since the day Edna Whitmore stepped into the skeletal remains of the Saltbox House, and today, the building at 112 Elm Street stood as a testament to the fact that light can be reclaimed from the deepest shadows. The sagging porch that had once looked like a broken jaw had been replaced by a wrap-around deck of treated cedar that smelled of the northern woods and the promise of summer afternoons. The exterior was no longer peeling grey flakes, but was painted a crisp bone white that caught the Wisconsin sun and turned the house into a beacon at the end of the gravel road. Inside, the damp cedar smell and the ancient dust had been banished, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of linseed oil and the earthy metallic tang of the malachite and ochre pigments Edna mixed with her own steady hands. The walls were now a gallery of liquid jewels, where the 74 watercolors of Florence glowed with a luminosity that seemed to pulse against the white backdrop. Edna stood in the center of the main room, wearing a paint-stained linen apron and a smile that had not been seen since 1977, her silver hair no longer a tight bun, but a soft frame for a face that looked 10 years younger. The sound of a luxury SUV crunching over the gravel road broke the morning silence, a heavy mechanical intrusion that signaled the arrival of the very people who had once left Edna for dead in this graveyard for failures. Marshall and Gail stepped out of the vehicle, looking profoundly out of place in their expensive tailored suits against the vibrant green of the Wisconsin spring. They had seen the feature in the Midwest Art Review titled "The Ghost Painters of Greenbush," and the greed that had once driven them to exile their mother was now pulling them back toward her like iron filings to a magnet. Marshall adjusted his silk tie with a nervous twitch of his fingers, while Gail clutched her designer handbag as if it were a shield against the reality of the transformation she was about to witness. They expected to find their mother living in a moldy ruin, broken by the weight of their betrayal. But as they looked up at the polished bone-white house, their expressions shifted from condescension to a sharp, predatory hunger. They were not here to apologize or to reconcile. They were here because they had finally realized that the inventory they had discarded was worth a fortune they could no longer control. When they stepped across the threshold, the silence of the gallery hit them like a physical weight, more powerful than any argument they had prepared in the car. Marshall looked at the paintings on the walls, the ones glowing with colors he had never seen in his digital catalogs, and his mouth went dry with the sudden realization of his own professional blindness. He saw the precision of the brushwork and the depth of the pigments, and he knew instinctively that this was the soul of the Whitmore legacy that he had tried to throw in a trash bin. Gail moved from frame to frame, her eyes calculating the market value of every piece with a clinical greed that made her face look sharp and brittle in the soft northern light. Edna did not move from her place behind the small mahogany desk. She simply watched them with a calm and observant clarity that made Marshall feel like a small child caught in a lie. She did not offer them tea or ask about the Jasper House. She simply waited for the inevitable moment when their greed would force them to speak the words that would seal their own fate. Marshall was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying that familiar condescending edge that had once made the chest of Edna feel as though it were filled with cold, heavy ash. He gestured vaguely at the watercolors and the pigment jars and told his mother that while he was impressed by her little hobby, she had to understand that these items represented assets that technically belonged to the Whitmore furniture estate. He spoke of inventory, of corporate ownership, and of the necessity of bringing these pieces back to Indianapolis to be properly marketed under his own management. He actually had the audacity to suggest that he was doing her a favor by offering to handle the logistics of her success, as if she were still the invisible bookkeeper who lived only to facilitate his comfort. To Marshall, the talent of his mother and the secret of Florence were just line items to be reclaimed for the sake of a failing business that was already hemorrhaging money in her absence. He stood there with a straight face and demanded the keys to the legacy she had discovered by hand, while Gail nodded in agreement, her eyes already picking out the frame she wanted for her own living room. Edna leaned forward, her hands resting flat on the mahogany desk, with a stability that was as cold and hard as the malachite stones she used for her paints. She looked her son in the eye and told him that he had once instructed her to consider this house an opportunity for a fresh start, and she had simply decided to follow his advice to the letter. She reminded him that he had called her a passenger and her work a burden of obsolete junk, so he should find it quite easy to walk away from a collection that had nothing to do with his digital vision of the future. The words were short and precise, cutting through his arrogance like a surgical blade through a thin sheet of paper, and the silence that followed was a vacuum that sucked the air from his lungs. Gail tried to intervene, her voice smooth and manipulative as she spoke of family unity and the importance of preserving the memory of their father through these paintings. Edna simply smiled, a small and devastatingly clear expression that told them she saw through the fake sentimentality to the hollow greed beneath their polished surfaces. She told them that the door had been locked for 40 years to keep people like them out, and it had worked perfectly until the day she found the key they were too blind to notice. Before Marshall could respond with another empty threat, Edna reached into the desk drawer and pulled out the notarized codicil from 1980 and a thick blue folder from her own attorney. She laid the documents on the table with a rhythmic thud that sounded like a gavel closing the book on their influence over her life forever. She explained in a calm, steady voice that the contents of the hidden atelier were legally severed from the Whitmore estate by a woman who knew exactly what kind of vultures she was raising. But the real blow came when she opened the blue folder and revealed the details of a quantum meruit claim for 49 years of unpaid administrative and creative labor she had performed for the Jasper store. She told Marshall that if he wanted to discuss the inventory of her life, she was more than happy to do so in a courtroom, where every hour of her silent sacrifice would be calculated at a professional market rate. The color drained from the face of Marshall, leaving him a mottled and pathetic purple, as he realized that the woman he had tried to erase now held a financial and legal weapon that could dismantle his entire empire in a single season. The confrontation ended not with a scream, but with the cold and heavy realization that the power dynamic of the Whitmore family had been inverted beyond any hope of recovery. Marshall tried to argue to bluster about the legality of the claim, but his voice lacked the conviction of a man who actually knew how to run a business without the invisible support of his mother. He looked at the watercolors one last time, seeing not art, but the millions of dollars that were slipping through his fingers because he had been too arrogant to value the hands that created them. Gail stood by the door, her designer handbag suddenly looking cheap and insignificant in the presence of a woman who had built a fortune from the dust of her own exile. They realized in that terrible moment that they had not sent their mother to a graveyard, but to a fortress where she had reclaimed her soul and her strength. Edna pointed to the door, her gesture simple and final, and as they walked out into the Wisconsin morning, they looked like ghosts fleeing the light of a sun that was finally rising on a truth they could no longer hide. The poetic justice that followed the departure of the children was as mechanical and precise as the inventory ledgers Edna had once kept for the family business. Without the hand-drawn catalogues and the meticulous technical knowledge of his mother, the Whitmore furniture brand lost its soul and its most loyal customers in less than 12 months. Marshall found that his digital photography and modern grey aesthetic could not replace the vibrant and luminous quality that Edna had provided for decades, and sales dropped by a staggering 40%. The business that he had once viewed as his birthright became a hollow shell of debt and inventory that no one wanted to buy because the heart of the design had been discarded. To keep the lights on in a failing company, Marshall was eventually forced to sell the Jasper mansion he had stolen from his mother, watching as strangers moved into the rooms she had polished with her own blood and sweat. He ended up living in a small rented apartment in Indianapolis, the very city he had once viewed with the arrogance of a king, now just another failed businessman who had traded a masterpiece for a pile of ash. Gail discovered that the clinical indifference she had used to mask her cruelty was a poor substitute for the technical skills and the resilience she had refused to learn from her mother. She invested her entire inheritance into a luxury decor franchise in Indianapolis, believing that her social status would guarantee a success she had never earned through labor. But without the ability to understand the quality of the materials or the history of the aesthetics she was trying to sell, the business collapsed into bankruptcy in just 8 months. She found herself drowning in legal fees and liquidated assets, her world of silver tea services and gold watches vanishing into the cold reality of her own incompetence. The irony was absolute, as the woman who had called her mother an expense to be minimized was forced to take a job as a junior clerk in the very law firm her husband owned. She spent her days handling the mundane administrative tasks she had once mocked in the life of Edna, becoming the very help she had once looked down upon with such polished contempt, and the lack of talent she displayed made her the laughingstock of the professional circles she had once tried so hard to impress. After the luxury SUV disappeared behind a cloud of gravel dust, Edna walked back into the center of the bone-white gallery and sat on the wooden stool where Florence had once painted her masterpieces. The silence of the house was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was a peaceful and rhythmic breathing that seemed to validate every circular motion of her cleaning rag and every stroke of her brush. She looked at the malachite green pigment on her fingers and felt a sudden and warm rush of tears beginning to fall down her cheeks. These were not the jagged sobs of the woman who had slept on the kitchen floor in 3 coats. They were the quiet and powerful tears of a soul that had finally found its way home. She wept for the girl who had burned a scholarship in 1977, and for the woman who had polished the floors of a mansion for a man who never loved her enough to give her a name. But mostly, she wept because the weight of the walls was gone, and for the first time in 49 years, the silence was not a cage but a canvas, waiting for the first stroke of a new and vibrant life. 2 years had passed since the luxury SUV of Marshall had kicked up the dust of Greenbush for the last time, leaving behind a woman who was no longer a ghost, but a master of her own light. At 78 years old, Edna Whitmore no longer woke to the shrill mechanical demand of an alarm clock or the heavy oppressive silence of a house she had to polish for the pride of someone else. Instead, she woke to the soft rhythmic trill of the Wisconsin meadowlarks and the smell of fresh cedar rain on the wrap-around deck she had built with the profits of her first solo exhibition. The morning sun did not filter through the grime of neglect, but poured through the expansive skylights of the Florence and Edna Gallery, illuminating a life that was as vibrant and permanent as the malachite pigments she mixed every Tuesday. She moved through the bone-white rooms with a grace that was no longer hunched by the weight of the inventory ledgers of Leonard, but was upright and steady, fueled by a purpose that belonged entirely to her. Her silver hair was a soft halo in the morning light, and her blue eyes were sharp with the clarity of a woman who had finally learned how to see the beauty in her own reflection. The small rear bedroom that had once been hidden behind a bolted wardrobe was now the heart of a thriving community of 10 women who gathered every Thursday afternoon to learn the secrets of the Florence method. Edna sat at the mahogany desk, not to calculate the overhead of a furniture store, but to demonstrate the precise surgical stroke of a sable brush dipped in ochre resin. She watched as these women, ranging in age from 60 to 85, discovered the vibrant power of their own hands, realizing that their years of silent sacrifice were not a dead end, but a foundation for a new and colorful architecture. The scent of linseed oil and lavender filled the air, a sensory bridge between the hidden past of Florence and the flourishing present of a woman who had refused to be erased. Edna had established the F&E Scholarship for late-blooming artists, funding 3 women every year to pursue the dreams they had set aside in 1977 or 1992. She was no longer just an illustrator of botanical details. She was a curator of souls, helping others find the keys to the locked doors in their own lives, while the town of Greenbush looked on with a reverence that felt like a warm silk blanket. The holiday cards Edna sent to Indianapolis every December were not messages of reconciliation, but prints of her latest masterpiece titled The Price of Greed, a study in leaden grays and sharp fractured lines. She heard through the legal updates from Norma that Marshall was still living in that rented apartment, his digital vision having collapsed into a pile of debts and unsold mahogany veneers. Gail remained a junior clerk in the law firm of her own husband, her polished indifference having been replaced by the heavy, repetitive reality of the administrative labor she had once mocked in her mother. Edna did not feel the cold, sharp edge of revenge. Instead, she felt a profound and quiet peace that came from knowing the balance of the world had finally been restored. She did not invite them to the gallery or offer to bail out the failing Whitmore brand, because she understood that some betrayals are too deep for a simple apology to bridge. She had moved beyond the need for their validation or their presence, and her silence was no longer a sign of acceptance but a boundary as strong as the oak door that had protected the secret of Florence for 40 years. As the sun began to set over the Wisconsin fields, casting long golden shadows across the cedar deck, Edna sat with a cup of tea and a blank piece of parchment. She thought of the 50 years she had spent opening doors for others, and the single month she had spent learning how to open the most important one for herself. "A locked door is only a wall if you do not have the patience to find the key," she whispered to the cooling air, her voice a raspy but certain sound in the gathering twilight. She realized that the derelict shack the children had given her as a charity gift was actually the most valuable asset she had ever possessed, because it forced her to stop being a passenger and start being the architect. The 49 years of silent dedication were not wasted. They were the training ground for the resilience she needed to turn dust into gold and lead into light. She looked at her paint-stained hands and felt a surge of gratitude for the exile that had saved her life, because the end of the Whitmore legacy was truly the beginning of the Edna Whitmore masterpiece. "My heart overflows with a profound and quiet gratitude for you having stayed with Edna through every step of this long and transformative journey, from the shadows of Jasper to the light of Greenbush." This story is not just about a woman who found a hidden room, but about the strength that resides in every soul that has been underestimated or ignored for too long. If you have ever felt like your years of dedication were a silent language that no one bothered to translate, or if you have been told that your time has passed when you feel your fire is just beginning, then I want you to know that your key is waiting for you. This narrative is a reminder that the world can take your house and your titles, but it can never take the precision of your eyes or the power of your character unless you allow it. We are a community of observers and resilient hearts, and your presence here is what allows these stories of justice and reclamation to be told to a world that desperately needs to hear them. Please take a moment right now and leave a single word in the comments that describes how you feel after witnessing the victory of Edna over the greed of those who tried to erase her. Whether that word is justice or freedom or hope, your participation is the heartbeat of this channel, and it helps us reach more people who need to remember their own worth. I want you to carry these lessons with you into your own week, that your value is not a line item in the ledger of someone else, and that your sacrifice is a seed that will eventually find its way to the sun. Share this story with someone in your life who feels invisible or who needs a reminder that it is never too late to reclaim the brush and paint a new life of autonomy and power. That justice is not a coincidence, but a consequence of character, and that the most dangerous person in the world is the one who has nothing left to lose and everything to discover. Thank you for being part of the heart of the story, and remember that the door is only locked until you decide to find the key. That you may always find the strength to turn your exile into a kingdom, and your silence into a masterpiece that the world cannot ignore. That you may recognize the vultures in your life before they have the chance to steal your soul, and that you may have the patience to look behind the wallpaper of your own circumstances for the secrets that were meant only for you. That you may never believe the lie that you are too old to start over, or that your dreams are just a hobby to be discarded when it becomes convenient for the greed of others. That your hands may always be steady as you mix the pigments of your own future, and that your heart may always be full of the peace that comes from knowing you are the queen of your own empire. We will see you in the next story, where the truth always finds a way to the light and the forgotten ones finally take their place at the head of the table. This is the heart of the story, where every ending is just the first stroke of a new and beautiful beginning.